I'm a carbon-based life form consisting mostly of water. My existence in this form is finite, so I try to simplify my life so I have more time to do what I want. Lately, the only thing I really want to do is sculpt. So I'm very happy to be here. Before we get started, can I ask you guys a few questions? How many of you are artists? Oh, okay. How many of you are educators? How many of you have ever thought of involving yourself in the creation of some sort of memorial? Okay, all right. So during the talk, well, first off, it was Octavia Butler, I believe, who said, the only interesting thing about me is what I write. I think the same holds true of me, sort of, in another context, so I'm going to keep my biography brief, and then, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background, and then I'll make a hard pivot into some of the work that I've worked on. And then by the time I'm done, hopefully you'll have a better idea of how projects like these are done. It's a heck of a thing. It's like a miracle any of this stuff gets made. I've made sculpture that gets put outside buildings, and it's just a phenomenal amount of work. But if you have any interest in doing that for yourself, you'll be better armed to do so. This is my remote. Okay, let's get started. So I'm keeping it simple tonight. I'm just going to tell you how I got my start, a reflection on how close we are to our past. And that's a loaded statement because the projects that I'm reviewing with you tonight are historical projects. I've done more than historical projects, but those are the projects that I've been focused on for the last 13 years. And I found that as an artist, well, it's not like I set off on a course to do historical projects. It's just that's the way my life worked out. I see myself as a small aircraft, and I identified an area of airspace that wasn't troubled, and I flew into it. And then one thing led to another, and one commission led to another, and so I've done a number of historical projects. In the process, I've gotten good at it, and I've come to really enjoy it, and it's also had an effect on me. It's kind of changed me. So we can get into that as we roll into this thing. So, and then I'll talk about 8 projects I worked on. I'll have some closing remarks, and after that you can ask me anything you want. All right, how did I get started? How did that small aircraft become anywhere near airborne? Well, I was born and raised in Detroit, and I spent in the days of my youth a fair amount of time at the Detroit Institute of Art, where this marvelous mural is located. And so I was no stranger to art. And I was very fortunate. Both of my parents were college educated. I pretty much hit the ground running. It was a lower middle class neighborhood, but hey, we were still in the top 1% of the world's population as far as income is concerned. So I had the benefit of being born in the Western world, so I kind of hit the lottery on that one. Everything was, as long as, we were in Detroit, so you have to dodge bullets once in a while. As long as you don't get hit, I was born at a place and in a time where things were working more or less in my favor. My mother was a music teacher. Her mother had actually been a music performer and had performed all over the country in the days of her youth before she had my mother. And that all came to an end when it became time to raise my mother. And then my grandmother went on to teach music at Wayne State University, which was no small deal because Wayne State is it's not Ivy League, but it's not chopped liver either. That's my mother with her choir. That looks like a man, curiously like a man on the end. I'm still trying to figure that out. Well, whatever. So that's my father. My father was an illustrator. Now see, my father was, he was one of those guys who in the 70s, in his 40s, I guess, or 50s, he was in that first wave of black illustrators that actually had a shot. Like having prepared himself and schooled himself, and disciplined himself, he had put himself in a position where he could benefit from coincidence. And so when the time came when major corporations were looking to serve, to sell to underserved markets, he was there along with a handful of other artists to help make that happen. So he was in that first wave of black artists that were actually allowed to make their own deals. So that was helpful to me because it's not like he taught me anything, but by watching him, you could learn a lot of cool stuff by watching him, because he would make his own deals with the VP of advertising for fill in the blank, be it Chevrolet or Ford or whatever. So all of this affected my mindset and helped put me on the trajectory that I'm on. And so I say all that to say that no one makes it alone. And I can't claim total authorship for the relative success I've had. My beginnings set me on this course. Notice that his name is spelled incorrectly. I did not do that. That was thanks to the Michigan Chronicle, who I lifted this photograph from. But he was a big shot in Detroit, and we would, in the process of driving down the main street, Woodward Avenue, people would give him the Black Power sign. It was all very nice. I remember getting people buying lunch for him if they saw him. The bill would be miraculously paid. He did a project called Root Stems and Flowers for Ford Motor Company that toured the country. That's my brother. Had a passing interest in geometric forms. Turned into a musician. He's still in Detroit. That's us in our backyard. That's me down near the ground striking a pose. Life wasn't perfect in 1964. We were at that time on the leading edge of a little war called the War in Vietnam. The Cold War was at an all-time high. Everything was messed up. Not that we cared. As you can see, all we cared about was digging a hole to China in the backyard and irritating our mothers for $1 or whatever it cost to buy some ice cream from the ice cream truck. That's me. I got to start. I spent 10 years in the defense industry until a sequence of unfortunate events brought me to the conclusion that I probably should be doing something else, or that I wanted to do something else. And the reason I put this here was this was one of the first limited editions that I created called Gifted Child. It was only 6 inches tall. The reason I placed this image on the screen is because it was instrumental in helping me get my first major commission from a city government. Because I had done this intentionally. The intention was create a number of small sculptures and prepare to compete for stuff that I knew was going to be made available, opportunities that I knew would be made available during the Olympic Games in 1996. And so I was tactical. I was thinking strategically and tactically on the advice of a phone call from a woman who I'd never met, who called me a couple years before the 96 Olympics and said, "Brian, I've been following your work. You need to get your act together. You got 2 years, and if you hit it hard enough, you've got a decent shot at making one of the sculptures. At least you'll be competitive." So again, you've got this the unknowable hand of the multiverse working in my favor, putting myself in a position to benefit from coincidence. But I had my own foundry. I had learned how to cast metal by hanging out with other artists And they were very clever guys. They didn't have any money to buy their own tools and equipment. So they had learned how to create their own industrial gas-fired appliances that were sufficient to melt bronze and cast it into the shapes that they wanted. And I hung out with them and learned how to do that stuff. So I was buying everything by mail order, and we would get dressed up in leathers and big helmets over our heads and melt bronze and go to town. And it was through these friends of mine that I learned how to do that. My education thus was sort of a non-matriculated, self-styled education, where it involved self-styled internships and homespun apprenticeships, and non-matriculated courses and workshops and professional development programs and so on and so forth. So I don't hold a degree in art, but that's okay. I seem to have, I'm geared up to do this, and so it worked out. Another view of that. I show you this because this was my most sophisticated limited edition before I convinced myself that I should stop making limited editions. Who is that guy? So there were other people whose work I was following at the time. Like we're talking, this was the 90s. Like I had a computer, but I had never plugged it in. It was sitting in the corner gathering dust. Still, I would go to Atlanta and see who was showing what and in what gallery, and so I became aware of certain people. And artists like Artist Lane, they were artists of color. Artist Lane, I believe she was from Canada. And so there were people that I could reach out to. I felt as if I was in a universe that contained more than just me, even though my universe was pretty small, and that was very helpful. So in my little constellation of associates, I would look to Artist Lane and a guy named Ed Hamilton, he's a sculptor based in Kentucky, and a guy named Richard Bennett, who I'll talk about later, who is based in Detroit, still works there. This is something he sculpted for the African American History Museum in Detroit. So I'm like a little snowball at this point, rolling downhill. I'm just about to make the transition from amateur to professional. You know, like you have the novice, and then you have a great big gulp, and then you have the amateur, and then you have this big gulf, really, really big, and then you can call yourself a professional. And then if you've been a professional long enough, then at some point you may clearly or safely say that you operate at the level of expert. I'm still way back here. I'm halfway through the jump between amateur and professional. But still, there's people it's not like I'm alone, which was very helpful. My father, Carl C. Owens, was a painter, as I said before. He only did one mural, and he did this after I became a professional artist. But I show this because I think it's one of the more impressive. It's an impressive photo, so I showed it. And by this time, I think this was like the late 90s. So I was well into my sculpture by that point in time. Anyway, he lived the life of an artist, and he had a big loft, and people bringing over bottles of wine, and paint tubes all over the place. So why can't I? If he can do it, I can do it. But that's the trap, because when the Father turns water into wine, lobsters into gold, or what have you, making it look easy because he doesn't talk to you about a whole lot of this stuff, then the Son says, well, hell, I can do it better than him. And then there was a rude awakening as I came to understand how difficult all this stuff is. He's gone now. But he did get a chance to see me do the sculpture in Atlanta, which I'm going to show you first. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to speak for about 2 or 3 minutes. What I'm going to say is going to sound a little pretentious. It's going to sound like I'm being a little self-absorbed, but there's a point to it. So just roll with me through this, okay? Give me a couple minutes to work this out. I was born in 1958, as you know. Bam! Toyota made its first entry into the American car market with a very unsuccessful, ugly vehicle that did well all over the world, except in the United States, where it tanked. Underpowered as it was not adaptable to US highways. 1958. Michael Jackson was born in 1958. He's the guy in the middle. Remember? This is how I care to remember him. He didn't come out looking like that. He was more smaller than that. In 1957, 1 year before, we had the Arkansas 9 who integrated a school in Arkansas. Oh, hell, now I forget the name of the Little Rock, that's right. So that was in 1957, but the reason I'm showing you this slide is to remind everyone that the civil rights movement was in full effect. It had been in full effect for a number of years, and it was no joke. You know, people were getting hurt. Happily, she survived the experience. Nuclear testing by the hundreds. And if they say they tested hundreds of them, that probably means they tested like a couple thousand of them, blowing up islands left and right in the Pacific, hoping, I suppose, that no one was in the vicinity. This was a feature of life in 1958. You know what that is? Anybody know what that is? That's Explorer 1. Remember the Sputnik? Everybody went crazy because the Soviets were so good at putting stuff into space, and all our rockets were going sideways and blowing up. Made us look like a bunch of idiots, and made the Russians look like gods. Made the former Soviet Empire look like godlike in its power. The Explorer 1 was the first successful satellite that was put in space. So 1 year later, 1958, the Explorer gets put into space on a rocket that didn't blow up. Jupiter C. NASA was born in 1958. NASA was born when I was born. So it must be good. And last but not least, a bunch of very, very, very smart guys learned how to put a whole bunch of electronics onto a little piece of glass the size of your fingernail. It took millions of dollars to do it. It would take decades and decades and decades for it to actually turn into retail products. But that's why we have this. And that's why you can send cat videos and speak poorly of your neighbors to your heart's content. Send pictures of your private parts to whoever you like. Why am I saying all this? Okay, hold on to your hats. I just wasted 5 minutes of your time talking about all this crap. Why did I do that? All right, here's my point. If on the day of my birth, you went back just 100 years, you would arrive before the Civil War. How's that even possible? How come we don't feel it? We don't feel it because we're emotional creatures. We feel connected to stuff that happens to us personally. We're not moved by logic and diagrams and stuff like that. What happens to us personally, that's what it's all about. But the truth is, if you on the day of my birth, you went back 100 years, you would have arrived before the Civil War and had plenty of time to choose sides. Hold that thought. So we talk about the Civil War because the Civil War brought me to my first commission. This was the first commission. It was like my big break. The year was 1996. Olympics were in Atlanta. And the city was trying very hard to make it look like it was a world-class city. And so they had hired like 13 sculptors to work on a bunch of different stuff. And they had to have like, they couldn't be all white guys or else they would look like jerks. So I had a chance to compete. Remember that lady who called me a couple years before and said, you better get your act together? I had my act together. So I competed and I beat out a couple of notable sculptors to get my first commission. And my first commission was to go on a street named Auburn Avenue in downtown Atlanta. And as you may already know, Auburn Avenue is where Martin Luther King grew up as a kid. It's where he's buried now with his wife. It's where the Martin Luther King Center is. There's a whole bunch of other historical stuff down there. And at the time, Auburn Avenue was at one time the financial and political epicenter of Atlanta as far as black folks were concerned. That's where all the businesses that were like doing well, they were all concentrated in that area. I'll just wait for this to. So historically, Auburn Avenue is like, it's a place of reverence for people who live there. And it made sense that the Corporation for Olympic Development would want to put some stuff there. And so they hired me to do 4 reliefs of historic figures who were considered so important to the history of the city after the Civil War that they're considered founding fathers and founding mothers of modern day Atlanta, as far as black folks were concerned. White folks had their heroes. These are black folks who were doing their thing to help other black folks because that's the way it worked. So this fellow here, his name was Reverend James Tate, and he's got an interesting story. I'm gonna try to keep it brief because I'm probably already taking too long. James Tate was a slave up until Emancipation Proclamation. He had the unusual distinction of being owned by his own father. They had some kind of a understanding and a relationship, and the father had secretly schooled him and taught him how to read and write, which was like a big time offense. Every single time you do that, every time you set somebody down, you were breaking the law like big time. And all that would have to happen is for someone to say, well, you taught your slave how to read in 10 lessons and then you've lost everything. But he learned math and he knew how to read and write and he understood how to conduct business when emancipation came. So when Atlanta was in ruins, right? So when Atlanta was being constructed and he was free to leave the plantation, then he was like, whew, and was extremely successful in running multiple small businesses in Atlanta. They called him the father of black business in Atlanta. He was like a one-man bank. He was like Wachovia with legs. Probably lost most of it. But he also taught at night, which I'm still trying to figure out how the dude slept. Because how do you run businesses during the day and then go teach at night? A bunch of kids who don't even know who their parents are, who have been assembled into railroad boxcars, because that's the closest thing you can finesse. That's the closest thing you have to a classroom. Apparently this dude did it, and there were a lot of other people who were doing the same thing, a number of other people. See this? This alludes to the railroad boxcar turned into a school. The railroad boxcar was something that was deployed as in a number of ways, as we'll see moving forward. The writing that you see in the background, it was the law that existed in Georgia before Emancipation Proclamation prohibiting slaves from being taught. So I thought it only proper to see it shattered. So what you see, like this is the main drag. That's Ebenezer Baptist Church. Okay, so I did 4 of them, right? That's Ebenezer Baptist Church in the background, which is a big deal because Martin Luther King used to go there and he preached there more than once. On the back of these granite pylons, on the front side of the granite pylon was the artwork, which is about like this. And on the back side, there was a description of the person portrayed. This is my second sculpture. It was part of the same contract. This lady here, her name was Carrie Steele Logan. A couple of years after the Emancipation Proclamation, she had a job and was managing to live on her own, and she actually was letting kids stay in her apartment. She had some kind of a studio or some kind of a room, and she would let kids sleep in her room because they didn't have a place to sleep at night. These are like kids who had been slaves who didn't know where their parents were, right? So the plantation said, get out, and the kids didn't have anywhere to go. They didn't know where their parents were. So they were uneducated and poorly clothed and fed. And it's not like she was rolling in money, but she would let kids stay in her house or her studio or whatever it was while she worked during the day. And then eventually she got herself a railroad boxcar, turned that into a little motel for kids with no place to go. So when I submitted this design, they got some pushback on it because they thought it looked kind of, they didn't like the downward lines. It looked like too much of a Christian thing, like too religious or mystical. And I was like, look, that was a mystical moment when she made the decision to go down this path, because once she committed herself, what's she gonna do? Kick them out? So she created an orphanage. She sold everything she had, wrote a book, raised some money, formed a 501c3. This is like in the late 1800s. Got some white folks to help her out, formed an orphanage, and then one thing led to another. It grew in size. She eventually sold it to the city of Atlanta, and her family ran it, and they run it to this day. And it's a decent place because I've been there. Isn't that something? So I won't show you the other 2 because I'm already probably behind. So we're still in Atlanta. There was a church named Friendship Baptist Church, and Friendship Baptist Church was actually established the year after the Civil War ended. And then 10 years after that, they had themselves like a nice building. Because these people who went to church, they went to church. They were all about giving tithes, and they had themselves like a very impressive structure, which got bigger and bigger and bigger, and they kept improving it. It was no joke. And the church stood for like for over 100 years. And then Mercedes-Benz Stadium, where the Atlanta Falcons play, said, we'd really like to have this property that your church is on. What would it take to get you off of it? And they made the church a deal that the church couldn't refuse, and they just moved a few blocks away and built themselves a new building. I think they were tired of that old building anyway. So they made out like bandits. But the only thing that remains of the church in its original location is this. So in the background you see, this is a long view, of course. I'm shooting from across the street. You see this granite pylon. It's about 6 foot tall, 4 feet wide, and it's got 3 pieces of bronze on the front. And if you walk up to it, it tells a story of what used to be there. So it's got a depiction of what the church looked like when it was standing, because it's demolished now. Then it's got a brief description in the center, and then look at that, railroad boxcar down at the bottom. Why is that there? Because they started their church in railroad boxcars. When the Civil War ended, they were trying to help educate all these kids that were running about and get them to go to church on Sunday. And I think they reached out, it was some sort of, some white folks living in Illinois or Ohio had donated a boxcar. It was in pretty good condition for the express purpose of them using it like this. And so they got themselves one, and they got more. And then as their church became larger, they did away with the boxcars, and they were able to like hold classes in the basement, or if it had a basement. I think it did have a basement. But you get the general idea. They just did the best they could where they were with what they had. And it was all about the boxcar. The church and its humble beginnings. So we're not in Atlanta now, we're over in Alabama. Dr. Arthur Harold Parker, nobody knows who he is, but you don't have to know who Dr. Arthur Harold Parker was to have like been affected by him in some way, because he established and then he ran what was the largest high school for blacks like in the world back in the early 1900s. So in Birmingham, Alabama, blacks couldn't go to high school. Everybody wanted to go, couldn't go. So when he opened his school for the first 18 students, they were very well behaved. And one thing led to another, and it grew in size, and he got funding. The high school was even when it got large, it was really a containment system so that the authorities could like keep all the black folks in one spot. But everybody recognized that, and they were willing to like roll with it because they understood what their situation was, and they were just going to do the best they could where they were with what they had. So back several years ago, Parker High School was in really bad shape, and they decided that the Board of Education decided to build a new high school, and they had some money left over, and they decided to put a sculpture of Dr. Parker in it, and I was selected to do that. So what you see here are photos of the clay, because the photos of the bronze I had are so like ridiculously poorly taken. But what you see is Dr. Parker briskly moving through whatever, navigating whatever scene was in front of him at the time. So what you see here is this is like this tall, right? The clay is too heavy to support its own weight. It's got steel inside of it that supports the weight, because without it, it would just like, I'd go get like a slice of pizza and come back and the head would be on the floor. So it's got to have metal inside. If you use too much clay, then it's too heavy to move around. Got to use like a right mix. But I had it down to a science. Like I had done enough projects to know what I was doing by this point. I had designed it so that the head would come off, so I could put his head on a little separate stand and work on it whilst listening to podcasts and stuff like that. It's kind of spooky. It reaches a point sometimes where it starts to actually get a little bit spooky, because once the head moves through that area of moves through the uncanny valley into something that is almost indistinguishable from life when viewed from 6 feet, that's spooky. Anyway, I digress. So he's walking briskly. Why is he walking so briskly? That was a very difficult thing. You see how his feet are separated from the surface? That's very unusual. It's hard to pull off. He's like doing this. That was a deliberate move on my part, because I wanted to suggest that time was of the essence, and for him, time was of the essence. Here's the deal. He was preparing thousands. Just before World War I, this was the largest high school for blacks in the United States. And he So, sorry. So he had created the largest high school for blacks in the United States, but he was preparing people for jobs that didn't exist. Like in those days, to have a high school degree from his school meant you knew how to do something specific. And people were not hiring in those specific areas if you had brown skin. So he was taking a gamble. He had bet his entire enterprise on the assumption that at some point in the near future, that these kids would have prepared themselves to some purpose and would be able to find meaningful employment in the field that they had selected. And that turned out to be the correct gamble. He was either right or he was wrong. If he was wrong, then it was all for nothing. If he was right, then time was of the essence, and every second that he spent screwing about was a tragedy. Now, as a sculptor, you have to be careful not to think you know people just because you sculpt them. Gordon Parks talks about this, and when he talks about the photographs of the people he took, the danger of assuming you know how other people are wired up. But I can't help but wonder, like I had to put myself in some kind of mindset. So that's the mindset I was in. And the working assumption was this was a man who was in a race against time. And so I tried to depict him as such. I'll stop there because I'm short on time. He looked like a white guy, but, you know, he was down for the cause. This is the bronze. Set in the courtyard of the school. It's a magnificent school. Everything was brand new by the time we got there. I had an associate of mine make those bronze glasses because he's the master at that. So making a sculpture is a mosaic art form. It's like it consists of many other art forms, and a professional artist is going to have a very difficult time trying to pull it off all by themselves. You have to bring a bunch of people into the mix because for political purposes and for financial purposes, you only have a fixed amount of time to get all this stuff done. The only way you can do it is to hire people, and then you rely on them, because if they screw up, you're screwed. So you're in a realm of just working with people that you trust because you've never known them to be untrustworthy. And so it is with Dr. Parker. That bow tie is welded on, but there's no visible evidence of a weld whatsoever. The glasses are welded onto the face. I'd bet money you couldn't find out where. And so as an artist, you work with people who operate at the level of expert in the realm that they're in the discipline that they're in.
Is he life-size?
Yeah, he's the same size he was in real life. Like, he's not 6 feet. He's more like, he's probably like, in real life, he's more like this. And it was important to them that I not sculpt him big. So he's about this tall, which is less than 6 feet, but still life-size, technically. St. Augustine Foot Soldiers Monument. Everybody knows where St. Augustine is, right? So I'll give you the short history on St. Augustine. St. Augustine was almost certainly the last city to be drawn into the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement, if you ask a historian when the civil rights movement occurred, they will say, like 1954 or 1964 or 1965, as a national thing. So the events that happened in St. Augustine happened in 1964 and directly led to or preceded the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So that was the last battle space. So if you ask a soldier why it's unwise to stay in contact with your adversary on a battlefield over a prolonged period of time, what will he say? because your adversary will adapt. The civil rights movement had been in full swing for 10 years. Both sides had adapted to the tactics of the other, except the segregationists had the advantage of being able to go deep into violence, where the civil rights workers had built-in limitations. So the segregationists had concocted all sorts of ways to mess with people, which we don't have to really get into, but it was a desperately violent situation in St. Augustine. So when I was contacted to do this, the lady said, look, she gave me the rundown. A lot of people came here. She had marched herself as a kid. She said a lot of people came here from other states. A lot of them were white. We had rabbis. We had like 60 rabbis show up in a bus. One day, there was the mother of some senator who happened to be white. She came down and put herself at risk. But what the monument is really a tribute to, or memorial to, are the people who suffered physical injury and financial injury as a consequence of marching. And some of those people really got messed up. So I was free to do the design how I wanted. This is where the sculpture is placed. This was used as a slave market. It was a general market, like they sold a bunch of different stuff there, but it was also a slave market. And then they like to bill it as the slave market because people, why not? It's more interesting that way. So that's the slave market, and then the sculpture goes in front of it, and the sculpture has a back, and the back of the sculpture is to the slave market. This is how it looks from a distance of maybe 15 feet. And we see our four marchers. The demographic, it was important to them that once I established the fact that I wanted to show four people, then they came up and they told me what the demographic should be. And they said, well, there's no way we can pay homage to everybody because there's too many people in the mix. But we got a white college student, we got a black guy in his 30s, we got a black woman in her 60s, and then we got a black teenager. And that represents a spectrum of most of the people who got jacked up fall into that, into that demographic. So each one was designed. It's difficult to see here, but each one was designed to be in a different emotional state. And the park, the thing that's cool about this is that the sculpture is physically located in the park where that was the epicenter of protests. Black folks weren't allowed to go into the park, but they would walk alongside the park, and white folks would segregationists would hold their rallies in the park. So this was like ground zero. And maybe 60 feet away from this sculpture is where Andrew Young almost got beat to death. Remember, he got knocked down and kicked, and he woke up in a hospital or something like that. This was ground zero. So let's take a closer look. And the background is meant to suggest that you're looking at a sculpture in the park that's depicted in the sculpture. So it's like a tautology or whatever. A different emotional state than this fellow. Oops, same dude. Who's in a different emotional state than the woman, who's in a different emotional state than the kid. So there was a limited budget and limited space. The real estate was prized. It was a miracle that it even got built. It got put there at all, because this is like the most valuable real estate in the whole city, is the Plaza de la Constitución with all of its Confederate uh, markers and all that jazz that's in there. But the people who were on that nonprofit organization that was paying me, they understood how city government worked, and they were able to like negotiate this crazy minefield. And it took them like about a year and a half. I thought they weren't going to pull it off. I said, well, okay, this project might not happen. But they figured out how to, they knew how to work it. And eventually, it's like Ukraine versus the Russians, right? The good guys eventually won, and the sculpture got placed where it had been intended to go. Because there were a lot of people who didn't want to see it there. There were a lot of teenagers in the marches. Teenagers were used a lot because this was a new tactic where teenagers under direct adult supervision were sent to march because the parents, if they marched, they would show up for work the next day and not have a job. Or if the parents, when they marched, they'd show up to make their mortgage payment and be told that their loan was being called due. But even using kids had extreme drawbacks, and that's another story. Once again, Enzo Torcoletti is a sculptor who designed and built the base. I mentioned him, but mad props to Enzo. He makes me look good. And he's a profound sculptor in his own right. So let's relax on this historical thing for a minute and talk about this sculpture, We the People. Remember that name, Richard Bennett, in an earlier slide? There was a big thing on top of a building, and I said, Richard Bennett this, Richard Bennett that. First time I met Richard Bennett, like I hadn't even thought I'd ever pick up a piece of clay. He was well into his career when I first met him. And I was just, I was working for General Electric or whatever. And I bought a piece of sculpture from him. I commissioned him to do a piece. I walked into his studio, which was an absolute mess. He's got welding machines on tracks that rolled back and forth on tracks on the ceiling. So if anyone broke in, it would be very difficult to steal his gear. Place is filled up with metal everywhere. And I walk around, and in the corner, there's this little thing that's turned upside down, and I reach down and pick it up and say, man, I like this. How much would you charge me to finish this? And he enjoyed that. That was so entertaining to him that he finished it and then sold it to me at a very low price. And that was the beginning of my relationship with Richard Bennett. And then as later on in time, decades would pass, literally decades, and we got to work together on this project. So he had a connection with Michigan State University, like he had worked out the details, and then we both figured out how to work with each other. He's based in Detroit. So We the People is installed in Michigan State University College of Law, the second building across from the moot courtroom. And you know how those arms of justice look a little bit wavy because the screen is wavy? That metal is like, it's as straight as anything can be that's made by hand. And you know how the scales of justice are like, usually you see them like even, with nothing on the scales? We put stuff on the scales. We put stuff representing the people on one scale and something that represents the state on the other scale, and then inclined it in favor of the people. Let's take a closer look. So I did the stuff that's on the scales, and he did everything else. Now this is what was on one of the scales. And I had a lot of fun with this. There's multiple ways of interpreting it. You can, we don't have time to get into all of this. But apparently there's somebody over here on the right-hand side who's, they're under scrutiny, and there's a lot of activity surrounding that person. So this was a lot of fun because, when you do these historic projects or these realistic projects, you've got to watch you got to watch yourself. You know, one drop too much alcohol, one drop too much caffeine, and you might have to call it a night and watch Netflix instead of working. So, but with this, it's so, it was so intuitive and so rough that I spent most of my time, like, you know, I probably tested positive for alcohol half the time I was working on it. I was just curious to see, like, what I could pull off. And so my working arrangement was like, here's my work, and here's a bunch of little airport bottles, and then I made sure I consumed a certain number of airport bottles. And the whole thing was just a giggle fest from start to finish. I had already decided what I wanted to do, and I found myself sort of released from the burden of being intricate and precise in every detail, and it was a lot of fun. And it was even more fun installing the thing, because when we installed it, it was me, Richard Bennett, and a couple of his workers who looked like they were straight off a street corner. Teeth, you know, bless their hearts, they were wearing hoodies and had their heads down because they were ashamed at the condition of their teeth having rotted from God knows what. But apparently they were trustworthy enough. Apparently they weren't hooked on meth, because they were trustworthy enough for Richard, and Richard has had some characters in his shop. They passed his litmus test, and so it was Richard, me, and two guys wearing hoodies who looked, you know, like they meant business installing this thing, and we made the cover of the magazine for their alma mater. I should have included a photo of it. Anyway, Michigan State University was very kind to us and helped us get our names out there, and included our photographs on the covers of their printed materials. Look at that. See, nobody asked Richard to do that. He could have just welded those stainless steel beams. He's got it so that, like, it all spins and attaches and stuff. Nobody asked him to do that. That's just Richard doing his thing. Look at that. See that shiny thing in the middle? If you ever plan to move it, you just take that thing out. It comes right out. Put it in a box with some proper packing to keep it from getting scratched. That's Richard Bennett. He's a straight up monster fabricator. Back to the history lessons. Frankie Muse Freeman. Okay, so nobody knows who Frankie Muse Freeman is except people who are living in St. Louis, or maybe are civil rights lawyers. She was a civil rights litigator back when to be a civil rights lawyer was an innovation. And she started down that path because nobody else would give her a job back in the mid-50s. She started her own company. She got her first assignment. It was her client versus the city of St. Louis. And she took the city to court and beat their behinds. She won a court case in 1954 where it was determined that it was unconstitutional and illegal to discriminate in public housing in St. Louis on the basis of color. Notice, in St. Louis. So she won this little battle, but she did it in such a manner that it could be like replicated, and other people followed suit, and before you know it, all hell's breaking loose because you've got lesser lawyers beating the pants off of their local city governments, and she gets credit for it. So she gets launched into she gets identified as somebody who's just a straight up badass lawyer, and she gets to hang with other people of her own stripe, and her career takes off. And in the end, her CV is as long as my arm. But one of the things that impressed me was she was an advisor to 3 presidents. I think Obama was one of the last ones. So it was commissioned as a gift to the city of St. Louis. So this is her. I met her when she was 101. And she was cantankerous. At first, I didn't know if she was all there because like she couldn't hear very well, and she couldn't see very well. And I'm wondering to myself, is this lady still there? She seemed like she was angry. There was a bunch of people up in her apartment, including her daughter. And I wanted to get my photograph taken with her, and I said, I got to do something to make this woman laugh. So her daughter said that there was an 80-year-old man who had just moved into the apartment and lived down the hall. And then I yelled, "She don't want no old man." And she busted out laughing. And we didn't get the laugh, we got the smile. She made a suggestion. I asked her a direct question regarding the sculpture, and she replied succinctly and directly and precisely to my question, and I included her suggestion in the sculpture. I did exactly what she told me to do. And that's when I knew she was still there. 101. So see that building? This is the building where she won her first case when she beat the pants off the city of St. Louis. That's the arch in the background. And now, of course, the city it's adopted her as a long lost daughter, and it put her in this new park directly across from the courthouse where she won her first case. Frankie Muse Freeman, kicking it old school, with her attaché and her copy of the paper that ran the morning of December 26th in 1955, when it was announced that the U.S. government upheld the lower court's decision and that segregation was illegal in this particular context. A few more shots. That paper is a faithful reproduction of the paper that was printed the morning that it was publicly declared that the circuit court, the findings of the circuit court had been upheld. The only thing I did was change the title. I changed the title of the article, and that's what she helped me with, because the title of the article in the actual paper was incomprehensibly stupid. And it didn't make sense. I didn't understand it. But she did, and she told me what to put. She told me what to put here. And she didn't have to think about it either. Again.
So what is the title?
Just Frankie Muse Freeman.
Oh, okay.
So again with the foot. You see how I'm trying to do interesting things with feet? It's difficult to pull that off. You can't do it by yourself. You gotta have people who have been down this road 10 times, and we've got stainless steel running up into her legs, running down into the ground. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to, I wanted her to have some pizzazz, because she was a styling lady, and I wanted to portray her that way. A few more photos. The base is made of bronze, incidentally. One last photo. Everybody loved it. They said it looks just like her, which is a relief. Because after working on something like this for a while, you can't see it anymore. But when I had it in my studio, there was an entourage of people that came down to the studio, and they were like, oh, it looks just like her. And that's when I stopped sweating. And her daughter came down also and helped me fix her hair, because I had goofed her hair up. So her daughter is also a sculptor. So it was nice getting her. I had her daughter up on a platform with me, figuring out how to make her hair more correct. That was the cat's meow, because what do I know about hair? So those are the projects. It's not all my projects. Those are the ones that I'm like the most proud of. So there's a project now that's underway. I'm making a sculpture for Jacksonville, and it involves two figures, and I'm sculpting a piano. So back in the early 1900s, there was a black area of town called La Villa, and of course it was segregated, which meant it was like a super collider for all the arts, all the music, all the crafts, all the poets, all the beatniks, all the geniuses and all the ne'er-do-wells would hang out in this one area, and it was like a little slice of New York for black folks. And it would spin off incredible talent, because that's what happens when you combine human beings in that way, right? The neighborhood doesn't exist in the same form anymore, like most of the buildings are gone. But it's the city of Jacksonville's intention to revitalize this area. And part of the revitalization involves creating a park called Lift Every Voice and Sing Park, because the two guys I'm going to sculpt are the guys who wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing. The two gentlemen are named, well, I call them by their middle names because I can't remember the first names. One of them is
James Weldon Johnson.
Yeah. And the other one is Rosamond Johnson. Right. Thank you for that. So anyway, so the city redevelopment is going to take place over a fairly large area. And what you see here is Lift Every Voice and Sing Park. So there's a lot going on outside of my scope of interest. And this is something that they've been planning for a long, long time. They've got funding lined up to do certain portions of it first. They're going to knock that park out first. So my sculpture will be installed somewhere in the spring of 2023, something like that. But it's a big deal, because if they complete their fundraising, there's going to be a lot of crazy cool stuff down there, including affordable housing. They've got this some kind of a metro thing that they're going to freak out and add to it so people can like zip around this area. They've identified where those Johnson brothers, where they grew up, like physically. They lived in a shotgun house, and the shotgun house, they know where it was. They've identified, like, they've scanned the earth, and they know where the corners of their house was. And they've taken that, and they're going to build like a bandshell type thing on it, so that performers and poets can come and do their thing. Living in more or less in the same space where the Johnson's house was located. I would show you photos, but there's a lot of proprietary artwork and stuff that I'm not at liberty to just copy and show, but you get the general idea. They're very serious about this. They got the money to do it. It's a foundation paying for everything in the park, most of everything, signage, and over a period of time or over a period of years, there's going to be multiple sculptures. I'm doing the first sculpture. So it's a sculpture of Weldon Johnson and Rosamond Johnson. And one of the things I was curious to know was that, can I actually sculpt these dudes' faces with the limited information that has been provided to me? And so this was an experiment to prove to myself, yeah, I think I can pull it off. So the expressions on their faces match up with the physics and the physicality of the design, which you'll see momentarily. That's Weldon. They're both in a different emotional state. And what's happening here is, okay, Weldon writes the lyrics to Lift Every Voice and Sing. Rosamond, 5 years later, writes the music to Lift Every Voice and Sing. And what this sculpture depicts is when they realize that they got something good. It's a moment of self-congratulation. Two brothers, one guy older than the other slightly, their arms around each other. These are two guys who are educated, well-dressed. They knew that all eyes were on them. And in this instant in time, they forget. and they have a private moment to themselves. And one brother says to the other, "You knocked it out of the park, son." What you're looking at there is an 18-inch tall maquette. The sculpture being too heavy to support its own weight would just fall over if there's nothing inside of it, right? So there's like aluminum inside of it and stuff. Because otherwise, I will go off to watch a Netflix and then come back the next day, and one of them would be like on the floor. So everything is intentional. Everything is by design. You begin with the end in mind in order to make something like this work. The final sculpture will be, it will not consist of two sculptures that are simply placed together. It will be a unified sculpture that transports and installs as a single unit. And to my knowledge, that's only been done once before, because like, why make it hard? And mine looks better. So we're breaking new ground. Nobody on earth has produced a completely kick-ass cast stone piano like the one we're making, and nobody has completed a sculpture with two life-size bronze figures, essentially traveling as a single unit. Close up. Now, those little heads are only this big, right? How can I sculpt them? How come they look as good as they do? They're so small. It's because I made those larger studies to begin with, to figure out if I could sculpt them in the first place. They're not perfect, but they're good enough to get me started. To make it any more perfect would be a waste of time. The musician is on the right side. His collar is open. His jacket is off. The poet, who has more of a standard career, like he starts doing businessy type stuff, he's more straight up and down, so he's got his tie on and retains his suit jacket. The figure on the left is the older one, the poet, and what you see in his hand is a 1/4 inch of waving bronze, and on the front of that bronze will be included lines, handwritten lines with notes, the actual notes to the song, Lift Every Voice and Sing. Last but not least, a design now underway. In 2019, I won a commission to sculpt an African landing memorial. Okay, what's that about? I'll try to blast through the history without boring you to tears. So, in the year 1619, there were Africans that had been enslaved and brought to the States, all over the continent, and Mexico and South America too. In 1619, slavery was nothing new. But in 1619, there was only one area that was occupied by, it was an English-occupied territory known as the Virginia Colony. And it was a corporation started by King James in order to put money in his pocket and make his friends rich. It was a colony designed to make money for the folks back home. And it was this Virginia colony that would become the epicenter for American-style democracy and everything that flowed from it. So the first Africans that were brought to the Virginia colony in 1619 hold a sort of special status, you may think of them as symbolic of the first African Americans, even though America didn't exist yet. And here's the reason why. The reason why is that the American approach to slavery, the American approach to economics, and the American approach to governance was all congealing, like it was working itself out in real time in the decades that followed 1619. And it was the trajectory that had its beginnings in the Virginia colony that guided the formation of the country and its attitude towards slavery and everything else. So I see the first 20 and odd Africans as being symbolic of the first African Americans for that reason. The design is underway. I've got design, I'm not going to show, I knew I'd be running out of time, so I'll just show you a few more slides. We got like 6 more slides. Where is this thing? So the first Africans who were brought to the Virginia colony landed at Fort Monroe, which way back in 1619, it was called Point Comfort, because it was anything but comfortable. I guess they were trying to get people to come there. There was nothing comfortable about it. Be that as it may, to make a long story short, there was a slave ship that, a very, very large vessel that left Africa. It was attacked at sea by a bunch of pirates. Pirates thinking that they were gonna score big time and get a bunch of loot and gold, and discover to their consternation that it's just filled up with 350 starving, horrified Africans. So they gathered up 20 and odd Africans, put them on their vessel, and decide, well, where do we go next? We got to get some provisions. It's not like gold we can keep forever. We got to get rid of this and get some money. Can we go to this port? No. Can we go to that port? No, because we didn't pay our pirate tax. Let's go to the Virginia colony. Yes, let's do that. And that's how they got there, with their 20 and odd Africans for sale. Now, here's the kicker. In 1619, in the colony of Virginia, slavery was illegal. King James had outlawed slavery in the colony. So how's this going to work? So the way it worked was these ingenious colonists they put the Africans into a system of forced labor in the guise of indentured servitude. So indentured means contract. It's contract servitude. So they put the Africans into a period of contract servitude of 7 years or more, except there's no contract. So the Africans, when they are brought ashore, when they're when they're put on the little dinghy, their status is slaves. Legal status is that of a slave. Then when the dinghy gets onto the shore and they step out and they put their foot on sand, their legal status is indeterminate. And then when they walk up on the beach, their legal status becomes indentured servant, except there's no contract to back up the transaction. And that's how the colonists got around it. So the colonists were really good at getting around things. And over the next 20 years, 25 years, depending on who you talk to, they figured out how to get around the norms that had been in place in that colony, because the colonists were well aware of slavery. They knew what slavery was, and they wanted in on it. Because why pay people when you can make them work for free? So these 20 and odd Africans that were first brought there were technically indentured servants, and then after some period of maybe 7 or 9 years, they were set free. They were enslaved, technically, but it was a different kind of slavery than we know. Than it would be transformed ultimately into something even more vicious than that, right? Because when these people had kids, their kids weren't slaves. So it's like temporary slavery. And there were laws on the books that said, well, there's certain things you can do to your indentured servant without a contract, but you can't do this other crazy stuff because that's going too far. And over a period of a couple decades, those laws that protected contract servants eroded, and we have slavery American style married to economic power American style, married to governance American style. And the three are like DNA, whirling around each other until it all gets worked out by the Civil War. Anyway, I didn't mean to go on like that. That's Fort Monroe as it exists. This is where the sculpture is going to go. It's in honor of the 20 and odd Africans. And we know where they came from. We know where they were captured from. That's the cool part. So we can actually tell like a more interesting story. If you zoom up into space 200 feet and we're looking down, and this is the center of the site, and you were to follow that line, and you kept going up into space to 3,000 feet, and you followed that line, and you were in orbit, and you followed that line, it would take you to the center of modern day Angola. So we know how to fix that line. So one of the many cool things about this artwork that we're going to make is that the artwork takes that line into account and lines up with the line to Angola. So what we see here is a view from, I don't know, a few hundred feet. We have the Chesapeake Bay out here. We've got grass. We've got a street. We've got cars parked. We've got the overlay of my little model that I made in my studio, and a circular area that represents a hard surface, like you can walk on it. A relief that lives at its center or near its center, and then another area where a sculpture is to go in front of it on the line to Angola. And that's where I'll stop. I'll just make my concluding remarks. If you'll be patient for just a second. I want to look at this because I want to get this right. Oh yeah. I remember now. So every time I do one of these commissions, I walk into the room thinking that I've got a fairly good grasp of history, having worked on this stuff as long as I have. And then it always happens, it's the same thing every time. The project opens up like a doorway into some new solar system of stuff. It's like a new multi-dimension of stuff that actually happened that I knew nothing about. So it's been quite the experience to work on these projects, and they all have something in common, though. Like on the surface, these sculptures are just undulating pieces of metal, right? But below the surface, they're about people. They're about the good, reaching out to the good. I have a friend named William Wiggins. He's a historian, and he's getting up there in age, and he's a friend of mine. And when I talk to him on the phone, I have to have a piece of paper and a pencil ready. He doesn't know this, but it's not a pencil, it's a pen, because a pen is quieter. Because he might say something that I need to hear. So he said this one time. He said, "We all know that quotation by Martin Luther King Jr., 'The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice.' But it doesn't bend on its own. It bends when people come together, often at great personal cost, to serve a purpose, larger than themselves."